Imagine a time when the forest whispered secrets only the wind could carry. Deep within its shadows, past the towering baobabs and beneath the endless sky, lay a village unlike any other. It was a place where traditions ruled, where the elders' words carried the weight of centuries, and where every sound of the drumbeat told stories of ancestors long gone. But within this village, there lived a woman named Nyasha, a name spoken with equal parts awe and fear. She was unlike anyone the villagers had ever known. Her beauty seemed otherworldly, her eyes carried the wisdom of generations, and her words, though few, lingered in the minds of all who heard them. Some said her voice could soothe even the fiercest storms, others swore she could speak to the earth itself, calling forth its hidden strength. Yet no man could claim her heart, and no one dared to say why. Suitors arrived, bold and eager, their chests puffed with confidence, only to leave the village soon after, their spirits broken, their silence deafening. Whispers spread like the dry season's fire. Could Nyasha truly be just a woman? Or was there something about her that the villagers could not understand? To many, she was a mystery, a force of nature. To others, she was an omen, a shadow cast over their traditions, disrupting the balance they held so dear. And then, one day, the village began to change. Crops withered without reason. Cattle grew restless and frail. The night skies seemed heavier, darker. A sense of unease crept into every corner of the village. And while no one could explain it, all fingers pointed in the same direction, toward Nyasha. Was it her presence that unsettled the seasons? Was she the reason men returned hollow, their spirits shattered? The questions grew louder, and with them, the villagers' fear. They gathered in hushed circles, their voices trembling as they spoke of curses and misfortune. What was it about this woman, this Nyasha, that no one could comprehend? What was it about her that made even the boldest elders falter in her gaze? And so, her name was whispered in the same breath as fear and power. A name that would come to define the village's darkest hour. But who was she truly? A healer? A sage? Or something far more extraordinary, something that the village could neither name nor accept? Beyond the dense forest and winding rivers, nestled in a valley where the earth's red soil met the sky's endless blue, lay a village. It was a place of rhythm and routine, where each day unfolded like the last, predictable and unchanging. Life here was simple, bound by the cycles of nature and the rules of tradition. The sun rose to the hum of early morning chores, the pounding of grain, the calls of livestock, and the laughter of children. It set to the crackling of fires, the murmur of prayers, and the low thrum of evening songs. The people of the village lived by codes as old as the land they tilled. Elders were the keepers of wisdom, their word law, their gaze enough to settle disputes. Men were hunters, farmers, and protectors, their worth measured in their ability to provide. Women, though no less vital, were confined to roles dictated by generations, caretakers, nurturers, silent pillars of the household. Yet beneath the surface of this harmonious existence ran a current of fear, fear of the unexplained, the extraordinary, and the uncontainable. Superstition wove itself into every part of life. A strange shadow cast by the moon could halt work for days. A bird singing at the wrong hour was a sign of impending doom. The villagers carried talismans to ward off curses, spoke in hushed tones of spirits that walked among them, and turned to their elders and diviners for guidance when the natural order seemed disturbed. It was into this world that Nyasha was born. From the moment of her arrival, her presence was remarkable. The midwife who delivered her spoke of the eerie calm with which Nyasha entered the world, her eyes wide open, as if she were already studying the world she had joined. As she grew, it became clear that she was unlike the other children. While the others played or squabbled, Nyasha was quiet, observant. By the time she was 7, she could recite the chants of the elders and knew the forest paths better than boys twice her age. By her teens, Nyasha's beauty had become the subject of endless gossip. Her skin was said to glow like the first light of dawn, her eyes to shine with the depth of the night sky. Her presence alone seemed to command attention. Yet it was not just her appearance that set her apart. Nyasha was intelligent in a way that unsettled those around her. She could outwit even the sharpest minds, and her understanding of the world seemed almost otherworldly. But her independence was what truly unnerved the village. Nyasha seemed to answer to no one, to follow no rule but her own. She did not defer to the expectations of others, nor did she seek the approval of men who came to court her. Many tried, bringing gifts of livestock, beads, and even promises of wealth. Yet none succeeded. One by one, they left, defeated, their confidence shattered. This was a source of great unease for the villagers. A woman of her beauty and age should have been married, should have been a mother by now. Her refusal to conform to these roles made her a subject of constant speculation. Some whispered that she was too proud, that her refusal of suitors would anger the gods. Others said she had been cursed or marked at birth. A few claimed that she had been touched by spirits, that her wisdom and independence were signs of powers beyond human comprehension. As the seasons passed, the unease grew. Whispers turned to suspicion, and suspicion to fear. Every misfortune, a failed crop, an injured child, a lost goat, seemed to circle back to Nyasha in the villagers' minds. They avoided her gaze, spoke her name only in whispers, and began to regard her as something more than human, something they could not understand and therefore could not trust. And so, Nyasha became an enigma, a figure both admired and feared, her presence a challenge to the carefully balanced traditions of the village. Her story was only beginning, yet already it was clear that it would not end like the others. For Nyasha was not just a woman, she was a question the village would soon have to answer. Over time, Nyasha's name began to drift through the village like smoke, thick and suffocating, clinging to every conversation. The men who had sought her affection, once bold and self-assured, returned from her doorstep quieter, their shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight unseen. They did not speak of what transpired, but their silence spoke louder than words. Some avoided the marketplace altogether, their faces pale and eyes downcast. Others disappeared entirely, abandoning the village as if fleeing from some unseen force. The women of the village whispered amongst themselves, their voices low, their glances furtive. They claimed the men had been cursed, that Nyasha's beauty was a trap laid by forces beyond their understanding. Some said her touch drained a man's spirit, leaving him hollow. Others insisted she spoke to the spirit of the forest, that her rejection was not born of pride but of a pact with beings no human could defy. As these rumors grew, so too did the village's misfortunes. It began with the harvest. Fields that had always yielded abundance now produced little more than withered stalks. The grain, once golden and ripe, seemed to rot before it could be gathered. The elders, who prided themselves on their knowledge of the land, could find no explanation. Then, the cattle grew restless. Once calm and obedient, they began to act strangely, wandering off in the dead of night or refusing to eat. Some fell ill with no visible cause, their once strong bodies wasting away. The villagers tried everything they knew, herbs, prayers, offerings, but nothing seemed to help. At night, the village no longer felt like the safe haven it had always been. Strange noises echoed through the air, the rustle of leaves when no wind blew, the distant sound of footsteps on paths that should have been empty, and, on some nights, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the forest itself. The villagers were afraid to speak openly of these things, but their fear was evident in the way they moved, their hurried steps, their reluctance to venture far from their homes after sunset. And always, the whispers returned to Nyasha. It began when the men pursued her, they said. The misfortune started when she turned them away. Her name became a shadow that loomed over every misstep, every tragedy. A child fell and scraped their knee. It was because Nyasha had walked past their home that morning. A pot cracked over the fire. Someone must have spoken her name too loudly. The elders, the ultimate arbiters of truth and tradition, began to meet more frequently. Their gatherings were solemn, their faces grave. These were men and women who had weathered storms, who had seen famine and disease, who had faced down challenges that would break lesser souls. Yet even they seemed uneasy, their voices low, their decisions slow. It was clear to them that the village was changing, that something was unraveling the threads of their carefully woven existence. And in the absence of any other explanation, their eyes, too, turned to Nyasha. She has disrupted the balance, one elder murmured. Her defiance has angered the spirits. Perhaps she is not defiant, another said, her voice hesitant. Perhaps she is something else entirely. And so, the decision was made. Nyasha, who had lived quietly on the edge of the village, who had harmed no one, would now be the center of their scrutiny. The elders resolved to act, to uncover the truth of who, or what, she was. For in their minds, to do nothing was to invite ruin upon them all. And as the village waited for the elders to act, the whispers grew louder, carrying with them fear, suspicion, and the weight of a decision that could not be undone. Nyasha's fate, and that of the village, hung in the balance, as fragile and as perilous as a single thread stretched taut. At last, the whispers reached a crescendo, and the elders could delay no longer. They gathered under the shade of the great baobab tree at the center of the village, summoning the people with the beating of the sacred drum. The sound echoed through the valley, a call that no one dared ignore. Families emerged from their homes, their faces tense with anticipation, their steps hesitant. The entire village knew what the meeting was about, yet no one spoke of it aloud. Nyasha's name had been on every tongue for weeks, but now it would be uttered openly, not in hushed tones behind closed doors. The crowd formed a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the fire that crackled at the center. The elders sat in their places of honor, their expressions grave, their voices low as they murmured among themselves. Finally, one of them, the oldest and most revered, stood and raised his hand for silence. "Bring her," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The villagers turned as a small group of men approached from the far end of the circle. In their midst walked Nyasha. She was calm, her step steady, her head held high. Her simple garments swayed lightly in the breeze, and her expression betrayed neither fear nor anger. She moved as though she were above the fray, as though the accusations that had filled the air meant nothing to her. As she entered the circle, the crowd parted to make way for her, their eyes avoiding hers. Some turned their heads, others stared at the ground, but no one dared to meet her gaze. The men who had brought her stepped aside, leaving her to stand alone before the elders. "Nyasha," the elder began, his tone heavy with solemnity. "You have been brought here to answer for the troubles that have befallen our village. Strange things have happened, things we cannot explain. The harvest fails, the cattle grow sick, and the very air around us feels heavy. All of these things began when the men who sought your hand returned, changed." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a tide of voices rising and falling, their tone a mix of anger and fear. But Nyasha did not flinch. She stood as still as the great baobab, her eyes fixed on the elder who addressed her. "Do you deny it?" he continued. "Do you deny that your presence has brought misfortune upon us?" Nyasha did not lower her head in submission, nor did she raise her voice in defense. Instead, she spoke with the quiet strength that had always set her apart. "I have done no harm," she said simply. "I have lived my life as I always have, and if misfortune has come to the village, it is not because of me." Her words were measured, her tone unwavering, yet they seemed to agitate the crowd further. Cries of "liar" and "witch" broke through the air, and the elders had to raise their hands to restore order. But the accusations did not stop. One by one, villagers stepped forward to speak against her. A woman claimed her child had fallen ill after crossing paths with Nyasha. A farmer said his crops had withered after seeing her gaze fall upon his fields. The men who had courted her spoke of sleepless nights, of a weight on their hearts they could not explain. Nyasha listened to it all without a word, her face a mask of calm. She did not interrupt, nor did she attempt to plead her case. This, more than anything, unsettled the villagers. They had expected tears, anger, or at least some sign of fear. But Nyasha gave them nothing. It was then that the elders decided they needed more than words. They needed proof. And so, they called for a diviner, a man known to travel from village to village, renowned for his ability to uncover the truth. When the diviner arrived, he carried with him an air of authority. He was a tall, wiry man, his face weathered by years spent under the sun, his eyes sharp and piercing. Around his neck hung a necklace of bones and beads, and in his hands, he carried a small bag from which he drew tools of his craft, shells, stones, and feathers. The villagers watched in tense silence as the diviner began his work. He circled Nyasha slowly, his eyes scanning her as though searching for some hidden mark. He muttered words in a language the villagers did not understand, casting his stones to the ground and studying how they fell. Finally, he stopped and turned to the elders. "This woman is no ordinary person," he said. "There is power within her, a power that few possess. But whether this power is a blessing or a curse, I cannot yet say." His words sent a ripple through the crowd, a mix of relief and dread. For some, the confirmation of Nyasha's power was proof enough of her guilt. For others, it was a sign that she might be more than what they had feared, something beyond their understanding. The elders conferred among themselves, their voices low and urgent. The diviner's revelation had answered some questions but raised others. What kind of power did Nyasha hold? And what would they do now that they knew? The crowd waited, their breath held, as the elders prepared to decide the fate of the woman who had become both their fascination and their fear. The diviner's words, meant to guide the villagers, instead deepened their uncertainty. Power, he had said, resided within Nyasha, a power neither entirely understood nor easily named. For some, this was confirmation of her otherworldly nature, an explanation for the unease that had crept into their lives. For others, it was a call to action, a sign that Nyasha's presence could no longer be tolerated. The whispers began again, louder this time, bolder. Fear and ignorance fed each other, growing into a storm that no elder, no diviner, could hope to control. The villagers spoke of balance and tradition, of the danger of allowing one person to disrupt the harmony they had built over generations. "She is not like us," they said. And that is reason enough. In their desperation, they convinced themselves that they were not acting out of malice but necessity. They told themselves that exiling Nyasha was the only way to restore order, to bring the village back to what it had been before. And so, the decision was made. The elders, who had once been the voices of reason, now found themselves swayed by the collective will of the people. They approached Nyasha one final time, their faces heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. "You must leave," they told her, their voices trembling. "For the good of the village, you must go. Your presence here brings fear and misfortune. Perhaps, away from us, you will find peace." Nyasha listened in silence, her face betraying no emotion. She did not argue, nor did she beg. She only nodded, her gaze steady, as if she had known this moment would come. Without a word, she turned and began to walk away, her steps slow but purposeful. The villagers watched her go, their faces a mixture of relief and unease. Some felt a sense of triumph, believing they had rid themselves of a threat. Others could not shake the guilt that clung to their hearts like a shadow. But none dared to stop her, and none dared to call her back. Nyasha walked until the village was no longer visible, until the voices and the murmurs faded into the rustling of the trees. The forest welcomed her with its silence, its vastness stretching out before her like an open hand. She moved deeper into its embrace, past towering trees and winding paths, until she found a place that felt untouched by human hands. There, in the heart of the forest, Nyasha built a life of solitude. She fashioned a home from the earth and the trees, a place where she could live without fear, without judgment. The animals became her companions, the stars her guide. She spoke to the wind, the rivers, the fire, and in their answers, she found a peace she had never known among her own people. But Nyasha did not vanish entirely. Her name lived on, whispered in the village she had left behind. Over time, her story grew, woven into the fabric of their folklore. She became a figure of both fear and reverence, a reminder of the dangers of misunderstanding and the power of those who dare to be different. Some said she had become a spirit of the forest, a guardian watching over those who respected its balance. Others claimed she still walked among the trees, her footsteps light as the breeze, her presence felt but never seen. And there were those who believed she had transcended entirely, her power growing with each passing season, her wisdom reaching beyond the boundaries of the forest. The villagers, despite their fear, never forgot her. They told her story to their children, not as a tale of triumph but as a warning. Do not judge what you cannot understand, the elders would say. And do not fear what you cannot control. For power, like the wind, cannot be held. It must be respected. And so, Nyasha's legacy endured, a thread that bound the village to the forest, to its mysteries, and to the lessons they had learned too late. She was gone, but she was not forgotten. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the trees and the firelight flickered, it was said that if you listened closely, you could hear her voice, calm, steady, and unbroken, just as it had always been. Generations passed, and with them, the memory of Nyasha transformed. What had once been whispered in fear became woven into the stories told by the elders. Around evening fires, beneath skies spattered with stars, her tale was shared with each new generation. The flames flickered as if to underscore the weight of the words, and the young leaned in close, their eyes wide with wonder and trepidation. Nyasha, the elders would begin, was a woman unlike any other. She walked among us as both one of us and apart from us, her spirit too vast to be confined within the walls of a single village. Her story became a lesson, not just a memory. In some tellings, Nyasha was a symbol of misunderstood strength, a reminder of the dangers of judging what one cannot understand. The elders would recount how the village had sought to exile her, not because she had done harm, but because her very existence challenged their way of life. She was feared, they would say, not for what she did, but for what she was. And in that fear, we lost sight of the truth. In other versions, her tale was a warning about the consequences of mob mentality. The villagers had acted out of desperation, their fear growing louder than reason. They had believed they were restoring balance, but in doing so, they had sown discord in their own hearts. The harvest remained meager, the cattle continued to falter, and the strange noises did not cease. Only then did they begin to wonder if the exile of Nyasha had been an act of harm rather than healing. When you act from fear, the elders would caution, you risk becoming the very thing you dread. The story also came to symbolize respect for individuality. Nyasha, the elders would explain, was not bound by the expectations placed upon her. She did not seek approval, nor did she conform to the roles laid out for her. And yet, in her independence, she did not harm those around her. Instead, it was the villagers' refusal to accept her difference that created the divide. Each person carries their own light, the elders would say, and no two lights are the same. To dim one because it does not burn like the others is to rob the world of its brilliance. As the years turned to decades and decades to centuries, Nyasha's tale grew. It became more than the story of a single woman, it became a reflection of the village itself, of its fears, its failures, and its lessons. It was told to warn against the dangers of ignorance, to inspire courage in the face of the unknown, and to remind the people of the importance of seeking understanding over judgment. But her story did not remain confined to the village where it began. Travelers who passed through carried the tale with them, sharing it in distant lands. In some places, Nyasha became a figure of myth, a spirit of the forest who could grant wisdom to those who sought her out. In others, she was revered as a protector of those who had been cast out, a guardian of the misunderstood. And yet, even as her story spread, it never lost its core. At its heart, it remained a tale of humanity, of fear and courage, of judgment and acceptance, of the ways we confront what we cannot explain. The elders would often end the story with a question, one that lingered in the minds of the listeners long after the fire had burned down to embers. What would you have done? They would ask. Would you have stood with the villagers, fearing what you did not understand? Or would you have had the courage to see Nyasha for who she truly was? The question was never meant to be answered aloud. It was meant to stir the spirit, to plant a seed of reflection that might one day grow into wisdom. For the story of Nyasha, like all great tales, was not just a story. It was a mirror, showing the people who they were and who they could become. And so, Nyasha's name endured, carried on the wind, etched in the hearts of those who listened. She became more than a memory, more than a myth. She became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, not in fear, but in understanding. Not in judgment, but in acceptance. Her legacy was one of strength, of resilience, and of the quiet power that comes from knowing oneself. It was a legacy that lived on in every whispered word, every crackling fire, and every heart willing to listen and learn. The story of Nyasha is not just a tale of one woman, it is a reflection of how we, as people, respond to what we do not understand. It shows us how quickly fear can cloud judgment, how suspicion can take root in ignorance, and how, in the name of self-preservation, we can inflict harm on the very ones we should cherish. Through Nyasha, we are reminded of the grave injustice that misunderstanding and fear can bring. The villagers, so bound by their traditions and their need for control, could not see her for who she truly was, a person of great strength and individuality, someone whose gifts, though different, could have brought wisdom and prosperity to the community if only they had been embraced. Instead, they allowed their fear to grow unchecked, mistaking her uniqueness for a threat. In doing so, they not only exiled Nyasha but also severed themselves from the potential she carried. This, too, is a lesson that rejecting what we do not understand often means turning away from opportunities to grow, to learn, and to become better. But Nyasha's story is not one of despair. It is also a tale of resilience, of the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's worth. Though the villagers could not accept her, Nyasha did not lose herself. She retreated into the forest, where she built a life of her own, guided by the power within her. In this, we find another truth, that true power lies not in seeking the approval of others, but in embracing one's unique gifts, even when the world cannot comprehend them. Nyasha's journey teaches us that our individuality is not a flaw but a source of strength. It is a reminder that even in solitude, there is dignity, and even in rejection, there is the possibility of renewal. As the flames of the fire die down, the lessons of Nyasha linger, etched into the hearts of those who hear her story. They remind us to confront our fears, to seek understanding, and to honor the light within ourselves and others. For it is in this understanding that we find not just peace, but the wisdom to build a world that is kinder, stronger, and more just. And now, as her story ends, I ask you this: what would you have done if you were one of Nyasha's villagers? Would you have acted out of fear, joining the voices that called for her exile? Or would you have stood beside her, seeking to understand the gifts she carried? Reflect on this question, and share your thoughts. Your voice, too, is part of this story now. If you found meaning in this tale, let us know by liking this video and sharing it with others who might find wisdom in Nyasha's journey. And if you wish to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and become part of a growing circle of listeners who cherish the richness of African folktales.